Do you remember when you were 17 years old? Remember when you were at the end of your high school career, sitting in those cramped little desks, listening to your teachers drone on and on? Did you have any idea that a bridge existed between you in that classroom and the rest of your life? Did you have any idea that you could actually build that bridge? I didn't either. In fact, when I was 17, I was pulled out of high school and sent to a convent in the middle of my senior year. Sounds rather medieval, doesn't it? But in the small Christian commune where I grew up, it was actually fairly normal. From the time my friends and I were little girls, we were taught that becoming a nun was the highest calling. So even though I was shocked to find myself in the middle of this convent at such a young age, I wasn't really that surprised. Now, I was one of the good girls, and it never occurred to me that I could actually do anything about being sent to this convent, like say no. My whole life it had been drilled into me that if I didn't follow God's will for my life, I was going straight to hell. On the streets, addicted to drugs, maybe an alcoholic, certainly a whore. So when Mother Betty called me on Christmas Eve to tell me that it was God's will that I entered the convent that night, it didn't occur to me to say no. In my mind, that would have been saying yes to a life of unspeakable horror and shame. So the commune where I had grown up had always insisted on unquestioning obedience. But the convent took this idea of obedience to a whole new level. Everything was decided for me, down to the food that I put on my plate. If I made the mistake of skipping the kielbasa in the buffet line, several nuns would suddenly appear and stand over me until I'd finished every last bite. So, in order to survive, I had to be quiet and do what I was told. But from the very beginning, my body was sending me signals, this isn't going to work. I was assigned to work in the kitchen, and all day long I pulled these sheet metal pans in and out of the ovens. And I was always forgetting to use the pot holders. So I had these burns on my hands, up and down my arms, and I was constantly in pain. I couldn't figure out what was going on. Why am I always burning myself? I was also responsible for defrosting all of the food for the next day's meals for 80 sisters. This meant walking into the walk-in freezer and hauling out 20-pound logs of turkey or a 50-pound crate of chicken legs. And I was supposed to do this every night before I went to bed. But I'd forget. No matter how many Post-it notes I stuck on my prayer book, I'd still forget. So every night I'd crawl into bed, exhausted, drifting off to sleep, and suddenly I jerk awake. Oh no, the freezer! I'd leap out of my bunk, pull on my long beige skirt over my flannel nightgown, and go tearing across the lawn to see if I could make it to the building before they locked it for the night. Night after night this happened, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. Why can't I remember anything? I seemed to be in a daze, even tripping over my own feet. The convent had these 4.5-foot window wells all around the perimeter of the building. I can't tell you how many times I fell into one of these window wells with my cello while I was walking to one of these orchestra rehearsals. I was never hurt, and neither was my cello, but I couldn't figure out what was going on. Why am I always falling? Well, my body was sending me signals. This isn't working, this isn't you, wake up. But I couldn't hear. And the longer I stayed there, the more my body screamed. By the end of 4 years, I was literally shaking with pent-up rage. Sitting in the sewing room, bent over an old Singer machine, or vacuuming the green-tiled stairwells, I could barely contain it. And I didn't know what was going on with this shaking. All I knew is that it was getting harder and harder to silence myself. Well, as strange as it may sound to you, and to me too, frankly, it never occurred to me that I could actually leave, or really that I wanted to. But one day, I found myself standing in the middle of France on a mission trip, and one of the nuns turned to me and she said, I see you at a crossroads. You could either stay here and make, the convent your life, or you could leave. And in that moment, when she said, "You could leave," it was like a light bulb went on. I don't have to do this anymore. So I went back home and I found the courage to leave everything behind. The convent, the commune, my family, my friends, everything I'd ever known, and risk walking straight into hell. But I had to find out if it was possible to create a life that didn't require that I silence myself. Well, despite all of the predictions otherwise, I didn't end up on the streets or addicted to heroin. Instead, I ended up graduating from Wellesley College and then going on to do my master's in writing. And along the way, I discovered that I not only had a gift for writing, but I had a gift for teaching writing. So by the time I graduated from college, I had this huge roster of students that I was working with on their college applications, helping them express their very best selves. And really, this was the key to their applications, this celebration of who they were and what their unique contributions were. And right away, these students were getting amazing results, all of them getting into some of the very best colleges in the nation. So looking at these results, I figured, wow, I found my calling, helping students recognize and express their unique selves. So a number of years went by, and I found myself working with the largest class of seniors that I'd ever worked with. All of these kids were incredible. They had top grades, top SAT scores, high-level extracurriculars, accolades, awards, captains of sports teams, academic teams, everything everyone said that they needed. But something was wrong, and it started with the unbelievable levels of stress that these kids were dealing with. They'd show up to their sessions literally shaking. Their knees are bouncing up and down. They can't look me in the eye. They're terrified they're not going to get into a good enough college, that they're not good enough. So I'm sitting next to them watching this shaking, and I start to have this dawning recognition. These students had been given one path to success, just the way that I had been given one path when I was sent to the convent. I started thinking, no more, this system that takes these incredible kids and shoves them down one path. I've got to do something about this. But what? So a few months later, it's March, and the flurry of admissions letters are coming out. And despite all of the stress, I'm sure that all of these amazing kids are going to be getting into their top choice schools. They'll be jumping for joy. But it turns out that only 2 students were accepted into their very top choice schools. Everybody else got into a good school, but when it came to their very top choice schools, almost everyone was sent to the wait list, which meant they were in limbo, neither accepted nor rejected, just waiting for a spot to open up. What was going on? Why, with their incredible academic performance, their impressive resumes, their beautiful essays, why weren't they getting accepted? What was going on with this waitlist status? And what was the point of all this stress if it didn't even work? Well, I started to look very closely at these students, and particularly the students who had gotten into their top choice schools. What did they do differently? And that's when I began to see that these students had all created something of their own, something that really lit them up and changed their communities for the better. Suddenly, it was so clear to me why these other students had all been waitlisted. They were too good on paper to reject, but they had nothing to distinguish them from everybody else. Well, it got me thinking, what if there were a way to teach students to discover what lights them up, and then to create a project that showcased this unique interest and served their communities in a really meaningful way? And as soon as that idea took hold, it was so easy to see that creating a project like this would radically change students' high school experience. It would launch them out of this old mode of passive obedience, and automatically, just by having a purpose and an excitement, plummet their stress and rocket their joy. They'd start thriving instead of surviving, all because of the pride that would come from knowing what their gifts were and how to bring them to the world. And as a result, they'd also end up increasing their chances of acceptance at their top choice schools because they become so compelling. Well, the more I thought about it, the more obvious it was that every student needed this to be completely lit up with excitement at their own gifts. But the question was, what exactly created this excitement? How could students who'd never really felt much excitement about anything before suddenly wake up to their interests? And as I began to look closely at this, I began to see that the excitement really popped when students began to ask two questions. What lights me up? And what problems do I want to solve? And then the next step was, once they'd answered those questions, was to go out and build a bridge between the thing that lit them up and the need that they saw in their communities. So that's exactly what I started doing. And the projects these kids have built are incredible. Let me share some of the results that I've seen. I'll start with Bane. She was an extraordinary young woman that I met when she was a sophomore in high school. And when I met her, she was really struggling because of severe dyslexia. But she did not want to let that define her. So she started to ask these two questions. What lights me up, and what problems do I want to solve? Now, as a freshman, she had joined her high school's criminal justice program and become incredibly passionate about it. She started to envision herself in a career as an attorney. But the fee to join this program was out of reach for many of her friends, and she felt it was unfair for them to be excluded from a program that had lit her up so much and given her so much hope about her future. So she decided that she would launch her own nonprofit organization to raise money for these kids, and she went on to pitch it to the Wharton School of Business, where she was the only teenager out of 72 companies to be chosen to work with them. And shortly after that, she received $100,000 in her first fundraising efforts. And today, she's in the process of bringing this program to schools all over the US. Now, this is a student whose dyslexia was so debilitating that one teacher told her she had a 50% chance of graduating high school. She could have just given up, but now she's thriving. And in fact, her father called in tears to say he was now at peace about his daughter's future. And isn't it this discovery of who we are and what lights us up and how to bring our gifts to the world, isn't this that gives us the greatest pride and happiness? That's certainly the experience that Alex had, another high school student, over the past year. Just a year ago, Alex was trudging home from school every day and plopping himself down in front of his computer to play video games all afternoon. He was like so many high school students, grayed out, uninspired, just going through the motions, but also stressed because of the immense academic pressures and the looming college applications. But Alex was getting fed up with this situation. He knew that he had so much more to give than this, so he started asking these two questions. What lights me up? And what problems do I want to solve? He started looking around his high school and recognizing that almost everyone was feeling the same way that he was. And he wanted to find a way to help them celebrate who they were, to really focus on what was great about them, rather than just focusing on the grades and test scores. Now, he had heard about Humans of New York, which is a project where this photographer in New York City goes around the streets and takes pictures of whoever he sees. And in the process of taking pictures, he'll ask his subjects about their lives, and these incredible stories come out. Well, Alex was so moved by these stories that he decided he wanted to do something similar. So he started to go around his high school and to ask students questions like, what's the coolest thing you've ever built? What's the best thing that's ever happened to you? And just as he'd hoped, story after story came pouring out. By the end of the year, he'd done dozens of interviews, and he'd had the opportunity to listen to students really open up and share stories he would normally never get to hear. But these interviews didn't just create a connection for him, they created a connection for everyone involved. The students would say things like, "You have no idea how much I needed that," when he was done. So Alex decided to pull all of these interviews together into a video montage, and he organized an end-of-year celebration for his school where he showcased all of these stories to a standing ovation. Afterward, Alex told me that creating a project like this changed him from someone who cared only about pleasing others to every day asking himself, How can I respect myself? Wow. Now that's when we feel incredible, isn't it? When we respect ourselves. Now, Alex was 17 years old when he created this transformation. So remember your 17-year-old self? What if back then you had asked yourself these two questions? What lights me up and what problems do I want to solve? Do you think that your life would be any different today? Well, what if you were to ask those questions now? What might you learn? What would you create? What would you build? And this, asking these kinds of questions and helping students build their bridges, this has become my life's work, to help students find their light so they can step out of those old, tight, constricted places, stop the shaking, and gift themselves the freedom to become their very best selves. And you know, this can feel frightening, but it's so worth it. I know because I did it. I walked away from everything that told me to obey, that told me to be quiet, that told me I had nothing to give. And it was frightening, like walking straight into hell. But when that light bulb went on and I realized there was another path, it didn't just illuminate the way for me. It shone a light on how every one of us can create our own path. Because I believe that everyone, every student, every individual, every one of us has something extraordinary to offer the world. And in this incredible innovation era, we need to rebel. We need to teach our kids to rebel against anything that would have us believe otherwise. So together, let's rise up from our cramped desks and break out of the old, outdated pathways of obedience so we can transform ourselves and our communities with our incredible gifts.